welcome everyone. We're so excited that you can be here for the second session of our hybrid day. We had our first in real life festival yesterday and it was a big success. So thanks to everyone who was there and participated. I have a couple of thank yous to our sponsors, the Institution for Savings and the Newburyport Bank. These have been our founding sponsors and been with us since 2005. We so appreciate it. It pays to bank locally. We've also received funding from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, as well as cultural councils in Newburyport, West Newbury, Georgetown, Raleigh, and Salisbury. We thank you so much for supporting the arts and arts initiatives. The Massachusetts Cultural Council itself also gave us a large grant, and the Yellow School and the Mass Center for the book. Now I'm going to introduce Bethany Groff-Durow, who is a member of our steering committee and also did a great job yesterday. Thank you so much, Bethany.
Thank you,
She's
Leslie.
also an author and the executive director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and she'll take it away. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Greg Melville. How are you, Greg?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here.
I love it. We're so happy you're here. I love in your bio, you describe yourself as a tombstone tourist, and I totally relate to that. So Greg Melville is an author, obviously, that's how you got here, adventure journalist and tombstone tourist whose writing has appeared in many of the country's top print publications. He's a U.S. Navy veteran. He's in the Navy Reserve. Greg, I think you were on reserve duty this weekend, were you not?
I was, yeah. I was on the USS Constitution yesterday morning.
No way.
A lot of fun. Yes.
That's amazing. I just visited the Constitution myself, and my husband is about to sing sea shanties. No, that's a lie. He's singing the naval hymn for the retirement of an officer on the Constitution.
Oh, very good.
So anyway, he also was deployed in Afghanistan. Was a speechwriter for top military officials and taught English for 4 years at the U.S. Naval Academy, where you won the APGAR Award for Teaching Excellence in 2019. You were from here, you're born and raised in Boston, and now live with your wife and 2 kids in Delaware. Yes, Delaware.
Yes.
Welcome, Greg.
It's like I said, it's great to talk to you. And I just also want to give a shameless plug for the Museum of Old Newbury, which is an amazing place. I haven't been there in a while, but I know it's probably close to like 140 or 150 years old, right? And
1877.
1877. And so amazing resource. As being a history buff myself, and growing up in Bedford, Mass, so kind of near the North Shore and everything, it's definitely a treasure of a place. So that must be an exciting place to work.
Oh, it's wonderful. There's so many wonderful dead people all over the area. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your book, Over My Dead Body.
Sure. So everyone has a cemetery story, or just about everyone has a cemetery story. There are about 160,000 cemeteries or burial grounds across the country. And if you were to put them all together, they would take up more space than the state of Delaware. Every single one of us passes a cemetery, probably on our way to work, on our way to school, whether we're walking or taking the bus or driving, and we tend to overlook them. But they're really these places of immense history, culture. They're these incredible places that give us this unfiltered prism to the past. And I bet if I put you on the spot, which I'm totally going to do right now, you could think of your own cemetery story. It could be happy or sad, or probably just some other experience that you've had with a cemetery or cemeteries. And so, and generally, like if sometimes when I give talks, I find it most fascinating to hear from other people and their cemetery stories. So I'm curious, do you have a cemetery story?
Oh man, so many cemetery stories. I think you probably asked the wrong person, but I'll give you my sort of favorite. For me, it's quite poignant. I was the manager of the Coffin House which is a funny little connection there, but in Newbury, it was the Coffin family.
Yeah.
And the entire Coffin family is buried right across the street from the house. And I love the connection of going to see where people lived and then going to visit them. And they're also my ancestors. So there was that extra little bit of, zhuzh there. So we'd go across the street, we'd say hi to Tristram and Judith Coffin. All the coffins are laid out there. The last male occupant, owner of the house was Joshua Coffin, who was a really incredible abolitionist, and Garrison called him the sort of firebrand of the abolition. He was very radical, and ended up dying before the end of the Civil War. So he's not terribly well known. He didn't write his own memoir. Long story short, I couldn't find him. And I was becoming really frustrated because I knew he was in that burying ground.
Yeah.
And I went, anyway, I ended up going to he's buried at the absolute furthest reaches away from the rest of his family. And his epitaph is a John Greenleaf Whittier poem that was written just for him. And it was, and it includes the words, "Smooth with thy free hand this grave." And I mean, I'm getting chills just talking about it. And it felt like, Joshua Coffin's ancestors enslaved people. And you can't tell me that his location at the absolute furthest reaches of this burying ground is not a message.
Yeah.
So that to me, standing at his grave and thinking, what messages are sent through not only the stones themselves, that is a powerful stone to me,
Right.
but also, by the placement of these stones, who are you going to be next to?
Yep.
For all eternity.
Yeah, it's amazing. And the story of
now I have to ask you yours.
Ooh. Well, it's funny. I wrote a whole book on it.
Yeah, you did.
But basically, the story of cemeteries is a story of so many things, right? It's a story of land use. It's a story of our history. It's a story of economics. It's a story of public health. It's the story of landscape architecture. It's the story of segregation. It's the story of equality. It's the story of politics, military, war, that are there for people to see if they're willing to look. Like you, when you're looking into the symbolism of, the placement of a specific tomb or a specific person. And so for me, honestly, the cemetery that in the moment, it gives the most meaning to me, the place that I find most interesting. And I like to talk about, because I feel like it's a part of cemeteries that often goes overlooked, literally and figuratively, is this cemetery that's in Delaware. And it's right outside of downtown Wilmington. And once a month, I usually run alongside the river that goes through Wilmington, Delaware. And along the way, this bike path that traces the river goes past Potter's Field. And Potter's Fields are kind of burial grounds of last resort for people, for the unclaimed dead. And oftentimes that can be people who are impoverished or imprisoned. And so this particular burial ground is right next to a women's prison, and you can't get to it by road. You can only get to it by this bike path, or kind of go through around the prison to get there. And it filled a few years ago, and there are 300 graves in it, and each one is just a small concrete post with a number on it. And the number signifies the person who died. And in Delaware is among the few states where, or a handful of states, I should say, where people, the unclaimed dead, are buried as opposed to cremated. And so they have built a new Potter's Field in another kind of unwanted space. And it's the same kind of thing, where there's just kind of this little marker with a number on it that marks the dead. And so when I run by there, I try and just take a moment, to generally, I try and stop and take a moment to kind of give agency to the people who passed away and were placed there. It's, to me, that the stories of Potter's Fields are really fascinating, the people who volunteer to maintain them, and then also what it says about us as a country, what it says about us as a culture, that we have these places for the unclaimed dead where they become just numbers. Gosh, I have so many other stories, but that's the kind of the one that I talk about a little bit now, because I want to do more research on Potter's Fields, and I want to bring more light to them. So yeah, not to drone on, but that's my.
No, I love it. And I'm reminded of, there's a lot of, actually, in one of our burying grounds in Newburyport, right in the middle of downtown, there's empty spaces. And Glee Woodworth, who's done, probably more for Newburyport the cemeteries than anyone, she is very interested in seeing if those are burials, if they're just granite ledges. But of course, the people that would have been buried potentially in these spaces are also people of color, the servants, people that, again, didn't have the resources to, to have an elaborate stone and may have died unexpectedly. So it also gives us that's hard too, because then if you can say there's bodies here, then what do? You're not going to exhume them and try to figure out who they are. You just have to then say there are bodies here in the end of the burying ground that is a traditionally Black neighborhood. Is that, that's an interesting question. So we're currently pursuing some ground penetrating radar funding. I mean, that must sort of be changing a little bit about the way that we know where people are buried, right? We can find them up.
Yeah. So in the United States, there has been this history of erasure of cemeteries, whether it's indigenous people cemeteries and burial grounds in the United States, across, including in New England, and then also underrepresented communities quite often. If you just look at like enslaved people's burial grounds, 6 million people died while enslaved in today's, what is the United States, between 1619 and emancipation. And we only know where a small, tiny percentage of those graves are. In a lot of cases, old enslaved people's burial grounds have been literally erased. And in other instances, the burial grounds themselves, there were no records that were kept. And this is the case in many, many plantations, for instance, down south, including Monticello and Mount Vernon, Jefferson's Monticello or Washington's Mount Vernon, where they deliberately did not keep records. Jefferson himself was this immensely meticulous record keeper on the most minute details of Monticello, but he never kept record of where the enslaved people's burial ground was. And only until the 21st century did archaeologists actually find it, one of the burial grounds. And so it gets to this point about kind of hiding where the bodies are buried, right? Intentionally, because they understand the moral depravity of the institution of slavery, and they don't want it to be memorialized into the future.
Do you think there might have been an element there of not wanting there to be a gathering place for, the enslaved people on the, you know what I mean? Because I think burying grounds become sort of a sacred space, and creating a sacred space for enslaved people in a way is, it's another deprivation, not giving them, I mean, they probably would have known where their friends and family were buried, but not having sort of a marked off space.
Right, and that's all part of it too, right? So there are all these, enslaved people couldn't have large gatherings, so there could be no funeral. Enslaved people generally were not allowed to show that they could read or write because it was illegal. So you couldn't create a gravestone necessarily, or not that gravestones would have been expensive anyway. But so to mark off a burial ground or to have a funeral ceremony was something that was kind of forbidden in most instances. Funerals often took place at night, and grave sites were generally marked off with field stones or in some other way. So there was absolutely that element of it as well, about gatherings, about having a memorial place for people to mourn and to gather later on, and not just during the funeral ceremonies. But there's also this intentionality that went into the lack of records,
right,
that had to take place as well, so that these places were not literally and figuratively on the map.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit? I was totally fascinated by the sort of secret history of Central Park that you addressed in your book. Talk a little bit about what's underneath Central Park.
Sure. So I'll just backtrack a little bit on how I got interested in cemeteries, which was in Bedford, Massachusetts, before my senior year of high school, or college rather. I got a job at the town digging graves and mostly just mowing the lawns in Shawshene Cemetery in Bedford, Massachusetts, not too far from Newburyport. And Shawshene Cemetery, like Oak Hill Cemetery in Newburyport, like Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, are garden cemeteries. They were kind of the initial city parks in America. Before there were outdoor gathering spaces in cities, before I guess there were these cemeteries, there were no outdoor gathering spaces. Boston Common, for instance, existed, but it was a place that was a military encampment, and they had public hangings there, and livestock roamed across Boston Common. And nature was seen in the early 19th century and in the 18th century as something to be conquered and overcome, and not something that you wanted to preserve. And so these cemeteries arose that had as kind of a public health solution, because the burial grounds within cities in the United States and in Europe as well were becoming so overcrowded. Trinity Churchyard in New York City has 100 graves in this postage stamped little space, 100 gravestones for about 100,000 bodies. And it's where Alexander Hamilton is buried. And at one point in the early 19th century, the smell was so overwhelming, people would avoid that city block. People thought that the odor was changing the color of their drapes in apartments around there. But people were also afraid of the miasmas, potentially diseases being carried through the air, they thought, or more correctly, polluting the water. And so there were all of these drives for cemetery reform in Boston and New York and other cities. And so these standalone cemeteries, burial grounds that were apart from houses of worship, arose. And one became very popular in New York City, and this is how I'm getting to Central Park. After the creation of Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, sparked this revolution of garden cemeteries. They became the biggest tourist attractions in towns. People would come and have picnics, and they would spend the day. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, became the second most popular tourist attraction in America, besides Niagara Falls.
Wow.
And this was Mount Auburn was created in the 1830s. I think Oak Hill was 1842 and in Newburyport, and then Greenwood in New York was also in the the late 1830s. And so people loved Greenwood so much, the city elders, I guess you could call them, of New York City, of Manhattan, decided that they wanted to create their own Central Park that didn't have dead bodies in it. And so they created Central Park. But Central Park, in order to do it, to create it and set off the land, a lot of it was undeveloped or was farmland. But on the Upper West Side, in what is now the West 70s, there was a village of mostly, kind of hardworking people, some Irish immigrants, mostly Black Americans, in this village called Seneca Village. And they had a school, they had a few churches, and they had, alongside those churches, burial grounds. And in order to create Central Park, the city evicted everyone in this village, and by force, ultimately. It was one of the lone havens for Black home ownership in New York State. And in order to be able to vote, you needed to own land at that point. So it was the largest Black voting community in New York. And so the city forcibly removed everyone from the village so they could create Central Park, pardon me. And in the process, they left the graveyards there. So Central Park was built over the graveyards of Seneca Village, and it still exists in that way today.
It's so complicated. I'll never think about Central Park other than, a cemetery with no bodies, except there are bodies. It's this sort of.
Right.
Wow.
And the other crazy thing is that it's probably the largest depository for human remains actively in New York today, because people go there to dump the cremated remains of their loved ones. There's even a company that will do the scattering of ashes for you if you live in another place and you can't get there. You can send them your loved one's ashes, and they'll do a video and a ceremony scattering people's ashes in Central Park.
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. You talk a little bit in your book about these different ways that people are beginning to envision, their continuing presence after they die. Different ways of being buried, not buried, composted. You talk a little bit about how maybe people are beginning to think differently about what happens to their bodies after they go.
Sure. So cemeteries are always changing. There's no kind of static format or formula to burial grounds. If you look at the burial grounds of the 1600s, whether it's in Massachusetts, Plymouth or Salem, or even throughout New England, they were very different places than in the 1800s than today. The way we look at death, the way we memorialize, when the Pilgrims first came to Plymouth, burial was just something of necessity that they did. They didn't usually generally bury anyone with any grave markers because they didn't want any potential adversaries to know the body count of the people who were dying the first couple of years. And burial was also a very natural process. There was no embalming. There weren't these expensive fancy vaults or caskets at that point. People were buried in a pine box or in a shroud. And then in the mid 1800s, burial changed as a result of the Civil War, and embalming arose, and the kind of burial funeral industry really arose from there. And then the 20th century, cemeteries continue to change. And now the cemetery, as we've known it for so long, is kind of dying because people are more mobile. They're not necessarily attached to a place because we're running out of space in some urban areas. And because of our impressions of death and how we memorialize ourselves is different. So if a gravestone carries, how much data does a gravestone carry? But how much data does Facebook carry? And so if we're going to be immortalized or immortalize ourselves, perhaps we don't need to necessarily do it with a gravestone anymore. That doesn't need to be our one little stake in the ground that tells someone we were there. Now we have our likes, our dislikes, our friends, our favorite movies, videos of ourselves, comments, all memorialized, all immortalized for us. And so digital immortality, if you look at Facebook, there are, as carrying the essence of our lives, there are more, they believe that in 50 years, there'll be more deceased people's accounts on Facebook than living people's accounts on Facebook, which would kind of make it the world's largest cemetery in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny that you say this because I was given, the First Parish Burying Ground in Newbury is honestly just about my favorite place on this earth. I'll take you there sometime. It's remarkable. Yeah. And it's, it's full of people I know. So, that have been dead for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So, I think that's also part of the story is that when you get to know one place, it really becomes like a little reunion. I know them, and this is this person's sister-in-law, and they were in court together, these two neighbors. There's something really sort of special about being able to create a community. Recreate a community based on headstones. That to me is really compelling. But I'm so provincial. I never leave Newburyport or old Newbury. But what I was thinking about is I was giving a tour to a group of school children, and we were in the cemetery. We were in the burying ground. It's not a cemetery. We were in the burying ground, and they're just deadly. They're bored. It's the beginning of June. Everybody just is sort of tapped out, and they're all looking at these stones. And finally, I said, "Okay," I'm trying to relate it to them, and I said, think of each one of these stones as this person's Facebook page. It's the curated presence of themselves to the world, and then let's look at the choices that they made on the stone and try to figure out who they were. And the kids were like, boop, lit up. Okay, well, why does this one have a, this one's bigger than that one? And well, why? Well, that one's for a child. Well, this one's small too, but it's for a woman. Why do you think that, or whatever? Maybe she had more money.
Yeah.
Maybe it was awesome. And I like that. I mean, again, I worry Facebook's going to disappear. As the historian in me, I mean, Glee will just say, please get a headstone, please. You don't have to put your body there. Just get some kind of headstone, because in the future, who knows whether or not we'll be able to access your Facebook information. I hope.
Yeah, that is
I
true.
hope we'll have that. But, here, 280 years later, I can go in and say, well, that guy was, a witchcraft accuser in, 1692. That guy was in court for fornication, whatever. You have a physical, the whole physical place. I find that fascinating. The sort of recreating a community based on the dead. It's back to what Spoon River Anthology idea.
If you were a historian or a family member tracking down, let's say 2 centuries from now, and you're tracking down one person, some person who becomes infamous or famous, or maybe some obscure person who somehow plays some odd role in history that you've discovered, or you just want to track down one of your ancestors, how much would you pay a company that has all the data of that person, has their voice, has their likeness, has so many different elements of their personality, and can create an AI avatar that can converse with you?
This is getting freaky now.
So, or, great, how much would you pay to talk to great grandma, and an avatar appears and can be like them with all the data that's provided on social media?
I think maybe we're starting a business now, Greg.
Yeah, there you go.
Get started. Virtual cemeteries for the future. No, I again, not to talk about me, but there's one record, Samuel Sewell, who was probably best known as one of the judges in the witch trials in 1692. His parents were from Newbury, and his parents are buried across the street from their house in the First Parish Cemetery, in the First Parish burying ground. And he writes in his diary, there's one that I know of, one record of a funeral in sort of 17th century, well, at least in 17th century Newbury, for sure. That's the only one I've ever found. And he talks about burying his mother and what he said and what people did and who's there and what they're wearing. It's amazing. But it is that sort of like, we can stand in that spot and know hundreds of years ago what was happening in that spot. And it's, that is a kind of an intimacy that in the future we're going to have to create digitally, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. That's actually a really good word. In fact, I wish I could have used that in my book, and I didn't. There's an intimacy that's involved when you walk through these places, these sacred spaces. And it doesn't feel like you're intruding as much as it feels like you're kind of sharing people's stories when you go through there, and you're piecing together the history of, like, when I was working at the cemetery in Bedford, that's really what opened my eyes to kind of the wonders of cemeteries and the stories, the amazing stories they tell, and the people's stories within them. Before, I just kind of thought of cemeteries as being kind of creepy, spooky places, until I realized kind of the culture and everything involved with them. And I don't know, it's there is a certain intimacy when you go to these places and kind of absorb yourself in the surroundings, and the sense that you get of art and culture and history and who we are as a country and who we were is just always so profound and amazing.
Absolutely. I want to ask you a question. I hope this is not a little bit of a blindside for you, but I'm curious about how your military experience. I am wedded forever to the Einmarn American Cemetery in France, because I wrote a book about a Marine that was killed in World War I, and visit his grave in France whenever I can. And there's a particular power in a military cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's difficult for civilians maybe to understand that. It was a learning curve for me. Can you talk a little bit about how your experience in the military has informed your thoughts about cemeteries and death and dying?
Wow. Yeah, you did blindside.
All right, that's a good
Woo!
Conversations with Bethany.
Yeah, I've actually I've performed the funeral services at a number of military ceremonies where I've presented the flag, on behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation. And there's nothing more beautiful and profound and heartbreaking and amazing about being a part of this moment and presenting that flag to a loved one. It's really fascinating. Military cemeteries play so many important and different roles in our culture. If you take the military cemeteries in Europe, they were the first cultural battlegrounds in the Cold War. The deliberately Christian imagery that they evoke was on purpose to kind of show the power of the United States and its philosophy versus the atheist communist philosophy that was sweeping through Europe in the 1940s and 1950s. So if you look at like the cemetery in Normandy, almost every single grave marker is a cross. And every, the way it's shaped is in a series of crosses. And the iconography that they have and the quotes that they use are all very Christian, which is extremely different from Arlington National Cemetery, where it is not, it's more neoclassical. You see a lot of kind of images that evoke Greek and Roman classical architecture and art. And there's a reason for that as well, because in the United States, these cemeteries are more to create a sort of Elysian fields, to evoke the heroism of the people who died for our country, and also, frankly, to be used as recruiting tools, like
you could be here
National
today.
Cemetery. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Like
exactly. And there are
someday.
songs about it, and people. So that's all a part of it as well. This is what you're sacrificing yourself for. This is in some ways to the point of, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, as it says above the amphitheater where the president gives the Memorial Day speech every year, which is an old quote from Horace. And so these cemeteries serve this incredibly sacred purpose. Arlington, to go into Arlington it's impossible not to be moved when you go there. It's just the landscape itself is gorgeous. How all the gravestones are all similar and how orderly they are, and just the grounds itself. But then again, Arlington was built basically as a way to, it was built on Robert E. Lee's property. And the first graves were built around his house in the flower beds so that he could never live there again. So it was kind of this symbol to the Confederacy and to Robert E. Lee that, for lack of a better term, I say in the book that they kind of flipped the bird at Robert E. Lee by creating a cemetery on his most beloved place in the world. Wow. So there's always this politics, culture, all kinds of different things that go into military cemeteries. But at their heart, they're these, I think that they haven't lost this kind of sacred, beautiful meaning to them.
Yeah, I'm just, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about what happened in World War I, where the dead, they were not prepared to handle the number of dead, and it was initially the burials were handled by the chaplain with sort of townsfolk digging graves, and then they were just burying them on the field, and then they were losing people, and families were getting erroneous notifications and all that. And then how different, how much that has changed in the military, where the way that notifications are handled so carefully. And it's just, I guess we've sadly learned over these conflicts how to handle military death, but it's been a grueling process for sure.
Yeah, can I tell you one other story with that?
Oh, please do.
Okay, it's about Gettysburg. So Gettysburg was one of the first national cemeteries. Before the Civil War, there were no national cemeteries, and they were really creations of necessity, obviously. But until that time, dying the good death in the United States was one where someone died at home. Their loved ones would be there to transcribe their last words, and people died in the death room. In people's houses, the parlor or the death room. Now it's called the living room. It was changed in the 20th century. I think watching the Red Sox in the death room wouldn't be quite as appropriate as watching it in the living room now. But So people really struggled with the just unspeakable carnage of the Civil War, and Union families were questioning, well, are my loved ones who are fighting for this cause, are they saved? Are they reaching salvation, or are they dying these kind of anonymous, gruesome deaths? And so there was this great concern. And when they had the convocation ceremony for Gettysburg, that's where Abraham Lincoln gave his address. And one of the points of the Gettysburg Address was for Lincoln to redefine what the good death is. You know, we cannot consecrate this ground. It is the people basically, you know, who died on this ground who did. So he redefined through this national cemetery what the good death was in the United States, to give meaning to the sacrifice that people's loved ones were making in the name of the Union in the Civil War.
Yeah, you know, you just gave me chills. I just thinking about that. You know, again, this is the beauty of books and of this kind of insight. I will never think of that Gettysburg Address the same again. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
You know, to think of it as redefining death at a time when people, I mean, I think a lot about how people were so much more familiar with death and dying, and how difficult, because, you know, there was no funeral parlor. The funeral parlor was your parlor.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, there's no casket, there's a coffin. Things got quite, you know, we removed ourselves from death. We're no longer wearing the hair of the departed beloved. And there's not, you know, we're not propping up Uncle George and taking his picture after he's dead and keeping a postmortem. Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm totally fascinated with postmortem photography as well, because it just has, again, this intimacy. Like, people had dead bodies around them all the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's changed in so many ways, and how that's reflected in the changing sort of architecture of burying grounds and cemeteries is really interesting to me as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we've removed ourselves a bit more from the physical process of dying, and, you know, and also we've removed ourselves from cemeteries. You know, the idea that you're going to take a picnic and go down to a cemetery, I think you know, for some people that happens, but most other people, I don't know if they think of doing that. It's kind of a shame.
Well, you know, it's it's funny you say that. So there are two things. First of all, natural cemeteries have arisen recently, and there's one actually that's attached to my old college alma mater, Kenyon College. They have their own natural burial ground that's part of this preserve that they've created on the kind of this green belt that they've created around the campus as a place for alumni, but then other people to be buried there. And it is this gorgeous place where that's intended for people to kind of commune with nature, and a lot of the new natural burial grounds are like that. But then also old-fashioned cemeteries, kind of the classic cemeteries like Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., they're finding that they need to connect with the community. And if they connect with the community, it's the only way to survive, right? Because you need to continue to raise money and be relevant in order to survive. So they have this membership program. It's all gated, and members are allowed to they can have their dogs run leashless through the cemetery at certain times of day. And
I just have to say, so my daughter lives in DC.
Yeah.
And I was researching a Newburyport man who's buried in the Congressional Cemetery.
Yeah.
And we were driving through DC, stopping to see. Anyway, we had the dog, and we were like, you what now? We have a gated dog park in a cemetery. It blew my mind. It's amazing. Yeah. And what a creative, wonderful idea.
Right. And they're amazingly innovative. They have apiaries that help the flowers and everything, and pollinate the flowers and the trees. And they sell the honey, which sells out immediately. They have a book club that meets in the chapel once a month, and it's an amazing book club. I actually sat in on one of their book clubs. Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles is a place where they want you to bring your date to go to a concert or an outdoor movie, or go to celebrate Day of the Dead, and they really embrace the local community around Hollywood Forever Cemetery. So it's not just a place where famous people are buried, but people have this emotional connection. So there is this kind of movement to create a new awareness and a new connection to cemeteries. It's kind of like the old, where people will go and have a picnic, or will go to spend time, or will go to walk their dog, or go to book club and that sort of thing. And I think that cemeteries now see the kind of the analog side of burials as being their salvation in some respects.
Yeah. Well, Greg, I could talk to you all day, and at some point we'll have to do that again, but I'm going to see if we have some questions from the audience. So Jennifer says, I love this book. My friends will say, are you talking about the cemetery book again? Were there any cemeteries or history that you left out of the book due to editing? And will there be an Over My Dead Body Part 2?
So if Over My Dead Body Part 2, I definitely have to go through Europe. I need an excuse to go to all the burial grounds.
I'll go with you.
Yeah. But so there are a couple places. First of all, the book itself is really kind of looking at American history through the prism of its cemeteries. And so each of the cemeteries in it kind of either played a role in history or somehow profoundly mirrored what was going on at certain times. So like I don't have the cemeteries of Salem in there because the cemeteries themselves, I couldn't find a good way of kind of telling a full story in a chapter about the cemeteries of Salem. But I told the story of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Mass, which is really the nation's first conservation area. Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the leaders creating the cemetery on this forest on the edge of town because they wanted to protect the forest. So Henry David Thoreau helped in the effort. And it was a place where Nathaniel Hawthorne, although he was not part of that transcendental movement, where he was buried, and Louisa May Alcott is buried there as well. And because burials were natural, they saw it as just a natural extension of this conservation area. So places like that, or Gettysburg, that have this kind of role in history. But one area that I didn't include, which I wish I could have, was, but I couldn't find the right story to tell, was St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery in New Orleans, which is an amazing place, right? I actually, in the paperback version that's going to come out in the fall, I have a couple of additions. I write a brief capsule on St. Louis No. 1 and also Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, which is this amazing kind of microcosm of modern American architecture. So yeah, there are a handful of places those are the two that first come to mind for me.
So will there be a volume 2? I guess that was
I don't know.
The question.
I'm not sure. To be determined.
We may have to talk you into it.
Yeah.
So we've got another question. This is from Glee, our tombstone hero of Newburyport. Have you researched your ancestry, and have you visited their memorials, cemeteries, burying grounds? Any interesting stories about that?
I don't have much interesting about that. My ancestry on the United States side is mostly Irish and Italian immigrants. One of my cousins has tracked down one of our ancestors to a burial ground in New York City, but we haven't. I want to investigate that with him. I don't have any really good stories about really my own family. In the book itself, I focus more on the stories of the cemeteries, as if the cemeteries are kind of the protagonist of each chapter, more than the individuals. But yeah, I probably should spend more time kind of tracking down my own family.
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting. I see, two things. One, I think that as a history museum in a place that has many, many, many families that sprang from, many sort of settler families, we are seeing a huge increase in genealogical tourism and their connections to cemeteries, and people asking for a map so they can find their ancestors. So I think that's an interesting part of the story, is this new sort of technology enabled genealogy and how that connects to the cemeteries. We have another question about the difference between cemeteries and burying grounds.
Sure. So Mount Auburn Cemetery, created in 1831. When Mount Auburn was created, it was untethered from, like I said, burial grounds, churchyards, or rather houses of worship, churchyards. And that was something that was new. Until that point, there were basically only two kinds of burial grounds or graveyards, and that were ones that were on family plots, maybe on a piece of property, or largely attached to a house of worship. So the founders of Mount Auburn had this idea of creating this standalone cemetery. It was based basically on Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, which was created for the same reason, for overcrowding, space reasons. It was on the edge of town. And so when they were trying to sell this idea of a mega burying ground, a supersized burying ground where people could buy a plot and have a permanent memorial to their loved one, which was really something that was new and different. They wanted to give it a fancy name. So they gave it the name cemetery, which had been used in Europe a little bit. I was reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the word cemetery appears in it, and that was written before Mount Auburn was created. But for the most part, it was popularized by the founders of Mount Auburn to make it sound more dignified and fancy. And from there, Mount Auburn just became the model for, it was the birthplace of landscape architecture. It was the first, like I said, urban park. And really, it became the model for burying grounds across the country. And so that's how the name cemetery was popularized.
And it means like Garden of the Dead or something,
Yes.
right? I mean, it's the sort of coffin caskets,
Exactly.
with jewelry boxes, right? So
Exactly.
give it a nice name. Well, this has been incredible, Greg. Obviously, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and we're gonna have to get you back.
Yeah, I love this. Thanks. You're a great conversationalist. I really appreciated talking to you.
Well, I would love to go on a cemetery tour with you. So come on up and we'll make that happen. Hi, Leslie.
Well, maybe we'll make that an in real life festival experience.
Oh, let's do that. You and I, we'll traipse around Newburyport. I'll show you my favorite dead people.
That would be amazing.
Well, this was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. At the risk of sounding a little morbid, which our house guest here, who is currently left literally 30 seconds ago to go visit her parents' graves here in Newburyport, which is, a meaningful experience for her, obviously. But I was like, they're talking all about that right now. What a coincidence. Wow. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Greg and Bethany, of course, and thank you to our participants for tuning in. We're really excited to have you here, and we have a whole rest of our day of other events, so we hope you can join us. And we're starting with Rebecca Mackay in 10 minutes.
Leslie, can I give one more very, very quick plug? The
Yes, absolutely.
Newburyhistory.org. We do burying ground and cemetery tours, tiptoe through the tombstones with glee all season. So keep an eye on our website. You can come tiptoe with us.
That would be so fun. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.